Two Amazon procurement nerds are back. More on our regular schedule today. We are recording Sunday morning. It is going to be 80 degrees in Danville today. So cannot wait. Beautiful weather. I was just telling Dr. Eloise before we started recording that I am dressed up extra fancy today. My neighbor, Fauzi, is a pretty famous orchestra conductor. He's been in charge of a group in Germany and done a lot of his work overseas. And he is leading the orchestra Friday, yesterday, and then or two shows yesterday, and then today. So my neighbors and I are all going to see him perform. So pretty excited about that. He's leading the Marin Symphony Orchestra today at 3:00 at the College of Marin. So little bit of excitement. I'm not the biggest fan of this type of music, but I feel like it's going to be super fun to go with the neighbors and cheer him on from afar.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
So before I get into my music mode, this is probably one of the most interesting topics I think that we're going to talk about on the podcast. So kudos to you, Dr. Eloise, for finding this story. It is around the shocking reason for the US fire trucks shortage. And I will say firefighters have a very near and dear place to my heart, not only for all the incredible work they've done through all the fires in California, but in high school, my very, very best friend, Stephanie, her dream as a child was to become a firefighter, and not as common for women, right? And so she gave her every free moment she had in high school to volunteering and doing things in the firefighting world. And she became a firefighter and now actually runs the Northern California Distribution Center for all of their supplies and materials. So when there's a crisis or anything, she actually runs and makes sure that all of the firefighters get all them. So she is heavily involved in procurement and supply chain for distribution in California of all of their supplies. So kind of a random little personal tidbit there.
How did I not know this? We have to get her on the show.
Yeah, I know.
We'll,
I was just texting with her actually, and I was thinking that she actually would be, if they allow it, we should absolutely have her come on and maybe do a part 2 of this topic.
absolutely. And I don't know how far, like all these topics, you start, like you hear an article and
Yeah.
or see something and it just like sits in your brain, and then it like the French fry one, and then it's like, wait a minute, and then you start unraveling, and the next thing you know, you're like down the rabbit hole into the gopher hole, and like climbing back up the tree. Yeah, these things are wild.
So so Dr. Eloise found a few really interesting videos. I'll share out a couple of them in case you're interested in going and checking them out, and we'll make sure to link them in the notes. But there is an independent news organization called More Perfect Union that has over 1.5 million YouTube subscribers. So they get pretty good reach. And this video, which was published on April 7th, so very, very new within the last week, already has almost 500,000 views. But the title is The Shocking Reason for the US Fire Truck Shortage. And they go through in detail what's happening and why this is such a crisis, and what are we going to do about it, and how can we make sure that things like this are prevented in the future. So definitely recommend checking out that video.
And they do a lot of really interesting reporting. This is one of those grassroots. This is just a sidebar, but they do a lot of grassroots reporting where they just actually talk to people in manufacturing, in supply chain, in logistics, in firefighting. So also, I wanted to give just a shout out to the entire firefighter community, because I too, as a Californian, very, very, very much appreciate what they do, and I have a lot of like career aspirations when I retire, and one of them would be sort of doing analytics or just supply chain sort of as a like old person volunteer. So because it has become such, and I think this is fair to say, fire season is longer, more intense, and it shadows everything in California.
Yeah, and another tangent and episode we should do is on the insurance crisis in
Hmm.
California.
Yeah.
So, my partner and I have a side hustle business where we buy and manage real estate. So, we have several properties in California and in other states. And one of my rentals, my insurance got dropped.
Mm.
And for no reason at all, insurance providers are trying to get out of California. So there's a whole world and business around, which technically ties into supply chain and procurement, but there's a huge crisis because of all the fires that have happened. It's becoming cost prohibitive for insurance providers to write policies in California.
Yes. Okay. And I also want to, and now we're going to get into it. There's a great documentary, and it's a free documentary, and it goes into the Oshkosh's create factory and it is a deep dive into watching them build fire trucks. And so there's a manufacturing aspect to this as well. But let's start with the fire truck availability.
Yeah.
And the first thing that jumps out in this article is that many of the fire trucks in California, especially during the LA fires, were not available. And the article makes the assertion that that was because there was not enough parts and not enough availability of parts. Prices have gone up, and municipalities are not able to pay for this, which and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then the next statement out was, and I think listeners on this show will appreciate this next comment, because most of the firefighter apparatus and manufacturers, or truck manufacturers, are owned by private equity. And so that has had a real impact on availability, longer lead times, fewer suppliers. So I was dual source discourse, right? That it's in our title, like you have to have multiple sources of supply. And when private equity, first thing that just like shot into my brain is that private equity consolidates, that you have reduced supplier availability. And so, and I'm not making a judgment here, by the way, I'm just pointing out that this is one of those trends. And so you have fewer trucks available, and really fewer parts, fewer replacement parts, because again, if you're trying to be profitable, you may or may not be focused on lower value. Let's say you have a truck that's 20 years old. A part for that may require you to reshift the manufacturing line and shut it down for 2 weeks, just so you can make that one set of parts. And meanwhile, you could just be running that same line, generating more profit. So again, I'm not making a judgment, but so of course, naturally, prices have gone up, and there's a lot of this is these costs are passed on to municipalities. And I'll just make one other comment and sort of pause, but a lot of what happens is the big cities will buy fire trucks, use them for a couple years, and then they'll sell them to smaller municipalities. And so there's a whole value chain of usage. So if the bigger cities are not buying them for whatever reason, then that has a follow-on effect further down the at least across the US.
Yeah. So a couple things. I'll start with the private equity piece, which you mentioned. So I think there's the whole issue here around the artificial supply shortages.
Hmm.
And this is because, as you mentioned, private equity firms have acquired multiple fire truck manufacturers. So they're basically creating a monopoly because they're eliminating competition, and it's leading to artificial bottlenecks in supply, because when you eliminate the competition, you become so reliant on the very limited manufacturers that are available in the market. And interesting, there's a group that I had not heard of before called the Rev Group, REV, and they are a single conglomerate that has basically monopolized the fire truck market. They are the dominant force, controlling about 30% of the market, just because of the acquisitions they've done on the manufacturing side. But the bigger challenge is influencing much more of the market indirectly because of their exclusive control over the components.
Yeah.
So 30% of the market really is a much bigger problem because of all of the components that you need to have to be able to do repairs. I mean, fire trucks break down. I mean, a lot of things happen. They're, heavy usage. They're going into, stressed environments. They're going off road. I mean, it's not like they're sitting in some pretty perfect garage all the time. So there's a lot of wear and tear. And then the other thing that really stood out to me when I was doing research on this topic is the delayed deliveries and repairs.
Yeah.
So now you take, I don't know, 3-4 years to even get a fire truck. You have it, but then it breaks down, and you still don't really have it because it's not usable, because you can't get your fire truck in working order. And the data that I found on this says the delivery times, one, for new fire trucks has gone from a few months up to 4 years, which is
Yeah.
just crazy to me, to think that a municipality places an order and has to wait 4 years, which, how can you even plan that far out this day and age with everything changing so fast? I feel like it's like merely impossible to do your forecasting and planning that far out.
Yeah.
And then you've got the parts and maintenance as an issue, because now you can only get parts and materials from a couple of these same suppliers. And then there's just major, major delays. So the PE firm here, or the PE firms, private equity roll-ups, are causing a huge, huge issue here. And I guess one of the questions is anyone going to do something about it? Like, is some are non-private equity groups going to come in here and get involved, or is private equity just going to own this?
Well, so by the way, just sidebar, because I think this is important. The U.S. military has the same problem with regard to parts. And what's interesting in that space, and I suspect it will eventually make its way here, is that the suppliers own the proprietary designs. So even if you could 3D print a specific screw or flange or whatever the gasket is, you're not allowed to, because the supplier owns the patent or the intellectual property on that whatever component is. So I think that this is a problem that's not going away. I I will try again. I will refer you to the Johnny Cash song, but essentially your answer is who's going to stand up. I think there's like there has been some pushback against private equity, but it's going to take major federal legislation. And I'm not advocating or not, I'm just stating the position. The problem is that if you look closely, the current vice president was backed by private equity, used to work in private equity. So there's probably not much chance that this is going to change anytime soon. Now, there might be market crashes or market events that change this dynamic, but right now I would not expect this to change.
Uh, The other thing I wonder is, there are antitrust laws. And is this breaking those laws? I would argue yes. It feels like there's a monopoly that's been created here, and is there the ability for state and federal organizations to take legal action to try to break up the monopoly and restore competitive market conditions?
I think I think that's a great point. I think the laws are there. I think there's a question about whether or not there is the political will to do that. But we'll have to see how that plays out, because there's a couple of and we can talk about this in a separate episode, but hospitals are owned increasingly by private equity, as are ambulance companies. So we could like extend this discussion in multiple directions, and there is pushback on some of those fronts. There's actually some legislation right now, or some court cases, I should say, that are bringing this to the forefront. But we won't go down that rabbit hole today.
Yeah. And then I think, to me, this whole situation underscores how financial manipulation in procurement and supply chain, especially for critical public goods such as fire trucks, directly undermines public safety and inflates taxpayers' costs. And this is just a huge, huge crisis. And I think we'll see this played out in other public safety areas as well.
And I think that the key part in what you just said is that procurement and supply chain is sort of this is overstating it. So I want to say this is a bit hyperbolic, but procurement and supply chain in some ways are being weaponized or profitized, or mechanisms for profit. And again, that's not a judgment. That's just sort of an objective fact. And I think this is the crisis also stems from there's multiple ways to look at the crisis, but I was also, because these costs get passed on to the cities and states and counties and whatnot.
And
And
ultimately us, right? The
right,
tax.
as a taxpayer, thank you. Uh, but um, so then I went looking, and I started researching the financial health of cities, because here in California we've had several big cities go into bankruptcy, and several others that may be close. And so in this, there's a financial state of the cities 2023 report by Truth in Accounting. They looked at 75 US cities and found that 50 could not pay their bills. So that's two-thirds could not pay, of cities could not pay their bills, with a combined debt of $267 billion. And the 10 cities most serious or most in danger of bankruptcy, and I know you all are thinking it's the blue states, but it's spread out, because you do have New York, Chicago, but then you have Houston, Philly, San Francisco, Honolulu, Boston, Dallas, Pittsburgh, Baltimore. So it's not just the blue cities. And if you go further, I imagine, because there's other research I've done in the past, where you actually go down to some of these really smaller communities, they too are in significant amounts of debt. So you can't just pass these increasing fire costs on, because cities have pension issues as well. So
And when you mentioned the financial crisis, when I was researching this topic, the data that I found looks like the cost of fire trucks since the private equity has come into the market has tripled.
yeah,
So imagine a fire truck, going from $1 million to $3 million. I mean, and you look at that multiplied out by an entire fleet across a city. I mean, that's a significant impact to someone's budget. And, what do you do? Do you get rid of other key services to cover the costs of the fire truck? Do you go into debt? Like, how do you manage that? So that's a pretty significant price increase.
yeah, and yeah. So, and in case you're wondering, because I was wondering, there are 56 companies that are in this industry, or in this operating in this sector. So, and some of those are private equity owned, and some of them are not.
Yeah, so this will be an interesting one to watch as to what happens with the fire truck manufacturing. Are we going to see more private equity come into the market? Are we going to see legal battles? Are we going to see independents coming in and trying to add some competition? And then looking at this on a large scale across other critical public services. So fire trucks is just one of the many where I think private equity has already started to come in or is continuing to eye as they can make massive profits in other areas.
Yeah, and so the question that like as I was like mulling this over is because I had watched the Oshkosh, it's actually Pierce Manufacturing that's owned by Oshkosh, but the Pierce Manufacturing that does the fire trucks, that in this documentary, what struck me, and it's always sort of sat rattling around in the back of my head, is that and they show this in exquisite detail, and it's an impressive operation, by the way. I have to say, I was just blown away, and I couldn't stop watching. It was an hour documentary. But what struck me is that every truck they build is custom, and so of course it got me thinking that why do they build every truck custom? And shouldn't they just, because procurement 101 would be, or sort of supply chain 101 would be, well, why not just have different sort of preset sort of options? And then of course it turns out that, well, while Pierce has 25% of the market that they build custom, Rev Group actually has a catalog of pre-built or sort of pre-designed trucks. But then and really the argument, so then it's like, okay, well, well, like, wait, why well, you have to tease this apart.
Mhm.
And so you might so the argument for custom manufacturing, custom design is each department has unique needs. There's various regulatory and safety compliance, higher margins for the manufacturers, and it's fit for purpose. But
My
you know,
mind is screaming parts and maintenance.
exactly, yeah, mine too, and Um, yeah, and then there are other brands like E1, Ferrara, Spartan ER, Smeel, and then of course as we are saying, the Rev Group. And so anyway, so it's because the lead time for custom is 12 to 24 months, whereas for the stock units it can be as low as 6 to 9 months. So uh, it's an interesting dynamic, and all those of us in supply chain like just have to be like running all these numbers in our heads and trade-offs, and it's like, yeah.
Yeah,
So
and I did not do the research on this. Would be worth doing a little bit more digging, but on the whole repair and maintenance, that's a massive business as well, right? And a massive expense, not just the initial cost, but keeping the machines running and all that's involved in the planning and forecasting.
yeah,
So someone has to figure out, okay, we've got and I'm in IT asset management. So to me, my mind is going to, okay, how do we know when there's refreshes, when there's renewals, when things are up for repair? Because if you can be proactive and make sure that you take care of things before it breaks down, that's a huge, huge benefit and cost savings to a municipality.
yeah, and I mean the corollaries here. I mean, what we're talking about is massive capital investments and maintaining those capital investments, and how do you and who supplies this? And I've long contended that the biggest risk in our supply chains comes from market changes, like private equity buying up all the suppliers that feed your manufacturing as an OEM. And so, like the bigger risks are not like somebody's financial health, or cyber risk goes from green to yellow or some silliness like that. It's, hey, are we tracking the supply market of suppliers and who they're owned by, and can we stave some of this off? And actually, I think the real work at the board level or at the executive level is to start thinking about, hey, if our critical suppliers get bought up by private equity, do we have to get into that market, or do we have to expand further down the value chain? And I suspect some of that happens, but not nearly enough.
And when it's a city, it's very hard because manufacturing is not their core competency. And are they going to be getting into the manufacturing business?
Right. And I actually, yeah, sorry. I left one critical piece out. I was thinking about like airlines or like these massive, mining or oil and gas, where you have these very capital intensive assets. And yeah, so I had gone for that realm. But yes, you're right. Like municipalities have no choice. They're stuck.
Yeah. Well, drop us a note in the comments if you have experience in the fire truck manufacturing world. That would really interesting to hear from folks who actually have hands-on experience. But even if you're working in another space where it involves, critical supplies and materials for public health, I think it's a really interesting topic.
Yeah, and undoubtedly these dynamics will come back as we branch off, and also if you just want to put a comment in thanking our fire service professionals, we are very thankful for them.
Yes. All right. Is that a wrap, Dr.
I
Eloise?
I think that's a wrap. That's fire engines, manufacturing, and supply chain, and undoubtedly we'll branch off on these topics.
All righty. We'll be back next week.